Hi again. There's a great deal of confusion around about the real Jesus. Especially if you're addicted to YouTube, you can find an awful lot of pseudo-scholarship and some genuine scholarship, which brings the historical Jesus front and focus. A lot of ex-witnesses, the community I come from and mix with most often, are confused about this too because there's so many conflicting views. You need to know, therefore, what the consensus of Christian scholarship is, and this man, better than anyone I can think of over the last 50, 60 years, represents that consensus of conservative scholarship and would come into conflict with the more extreme positions which are being espoused widely on the internet by fringe scholars such as Richard Carrier and Robert Price and something of Bart Ehrman. Ehrman is a first-rate textual critic, but he's hardly at the standard of this man as a New Testament scholar. The Real Jesus by F.F. Bruce, part of the Jesus Library series that was edited by Michael Green, by the way. So I want to put this on our basic Christian library list. That's a playlist, by the way, that's got a couple of dozen books on it by now, I think. And it needs to be said that Bruce had already written a great deal about the historical reliability of the New Testament, including 2 commentaries on Acts, by the time he got around to this. This is in his old age, so it was published in 1985. Here's the blurb on the back. F.F. Bruce, The Real Jesus. Bruce asks who is Jesus, and not who was Jesus. He contends that the Jesus who is the center of Christian worship today is identical with the historical Jesus who lived and taught in Palestine over 1900 years ago. The Real Jesus surveys the life and teaching of this historical Jesus, peeling away the accretions of the centuries as well as the distortions induced by 20th century technology to discover his abiding significance. The Real Jesus is not designed as a reply to the Channel 4 series, Jesus the Evidence, but to some extent covers the same ground, coming to direct and challenging conclusions. F.F. Bruce examines the findings of current New Testament scholarship with regard to the Gospels and makes accessible many theological concepts. Preconceptions, myths, and objections are rigorously examined, keeping the general reader in view throughout. Now, it needs to be said that this comes just before the Jesus Seminar stuff, so the problem that Bruce is addressing here of wild speculation about the historical Jesus is very timely in view of what's happened since, and not only the Jesus Seminar, but the new atheism movement. And then a little bio. F.F. Bruce, formerly Rylands Professor of Biblical Criticism and Exegesis at Manchester University, is the author of some 40 books, among which Jesus and Christian Origins Outside the New Testament and the Hard Sayings of Jesus. Now, we've done quite a few videos on the Hard Sayings of Jesus. If you look up our hermeneutics playlist, you'll find a lot of them there. Here's Bruce's intro. Who is Jesus? The following pages give 2 answers to this question. First, he is a historical figure. Second, he is our eternal contemporary. Both these answers are true. Both will be repeated in greater detail as we go on. Who is Jesus is a question that many people asked during the few years of his public activity early in the 1st century AD. The same question is debated with animation in many parts of the world today. Every now and then we are presented with a variety of answers to it in books or in television programs. Some answers are supported by serious arguments. Others are simply ventilated by way of novelty. One thing is clear, not all the answers can be right. Here are some answers which we have been offered within the past 20 years. There never was such a person. He was the founder of a drug-taking community which went in for religious hallucinations and devised a code of lofty ethical teachings to provide a cover for its real activities. And that's a response to the idea that Jesus was actually a code name for Amanita muscaria, a red-dotted mushroom. The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross was the name of the book. Some 55 years ago, I remember bumping into it when I was going to door as a Jehovah's Witness. Have you ever heard of it now? Well, it went the way of many fringe theories, although it was promoted, by the way, by a real scholar, but a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, not a New Testament or Old Testament scholar, John Allegro. He formed an inner group of disciples to whom he taught a libertine doctrine of freedom from moral restraint, while to the wider public he prescribed a high ethical standard. Or he encouraged opposition to the occupying Roman forces in Judea, making sure, for example, that his followers were armed at the Last Supper. The pacific teaching about the turning the other cheek and so forth was ascribed to him at a later date, when his followers wished to distance themselves from the Jewish rebels whose revolt against Rome failed so disastrously in AD 70. That theory, by the way, of Jesus really being a zealot, who's the real Jesus has disappeared from history, is a very old one, going back at least to the 19th century. He was an Essene. His 40 days in the wilderness were spent at the community headquarters of Qumran, where he learned the doctrine taught by the teacher of righteousness, if indeed he was not himself the teacher of righteousness. That one seems to be still going around. He had indeed some associations with the Qumran community, but far from being the teacher of righteousness, he is denounced in the Qumran literature as the wicked priest, the implacable opponent of the teacher of righteousness. And then he sums up these discordant answers. What these discordant answers have in common is that they all differ not merely from the New Testament witness to Jesus, but from the account of him approved by the majority of modern historians within those whose field his life and times fall. It is not as though the wide range of speculation lying behind those answers were necessitated by the absence of hard evidence for more positive conclusions. The evidence is there, mainly in the pages of the New Testament. A generation ago, one school of theologians kept on telling us that because the New Testament writers were preachers, not historians, the attempt to use their writings to discover the Jesus of history was both illegitimate and impossible. No one, we were assured, could write a life of Jesus because the materials were not available. When this school was at the height of its influence, one scholar who defied them by doing what they pronounced to be impossible and illegitimate declared his conviction that a simple application of the normal standards of judgment with which historical and scientific study has made us familiar will enable us to arrive at a fair amount of accurate narrative. That, by the way, was C.J. Cadoux, C-A-D-O-U-X. This was a modest claim, and the scholar who made it justified it by taking over 200 pages to write his life of Jesus. The evidence is not to be handled uncritically. We can, in fact, reach more certain and convincing conclusions when the accepted canons of historical study are fully utilized. But it is best not to be excessively influenced by one school of thought or climate of opinion. That was the trouble with the old 19th century quest of the historical Jesus, whose inadequacies were so thoroughly exposed by Albert Schweitzer in an epoch-making work. The second half of the 20th century has seen the rise of a new quest of the historical Jesus. It remains to be seen if it will be more successful than its predecessor. A 19th century historian who was free from the influence of contemporary schools of theological thought and was in fact no believer in revealed religion, expressed this opinion about Jesus' abiding influence in an area of human life, ethics, which was to him one of special historical enquiry. And this, by the way, is the great rationalist historian Lecky. He says, quote, "The character of Jesus has not only been the highest pattern of virtue, but the strongest incentive to its practice, and has exerted so deep an influence that it may truly be said that the simple record of 3 short years of active life has done more to regenerate and to soften mankind than all the disquisitions of philosophers and than all the exhortations of moralists." That's Lecky in his History of European Morals. Now Bruce concludes this intro, that is a non-Christian, or at least not distinctively Christian, judgment of one sense in which Jesus is not only a historical figure, but also our eternal contemporary. His influence lives on. but there are other senses, as we shall see. Jesus himself lives on. So I'm going to start into the book proper next time. I'll put in a link to a series we did some years ago called Why Jesus? It was 4 videos based on some notes we put together for an outreach at a university in Toronto, York University. It's really about the classic 10 objections to the Christian faith. See you next time.